for YouTube. I sort of stopped uploading to the iTunes because people haven't had any success. I probably will upload there just to be diligent, but I've been more diligent uploading the class lectures to YouTube if you're listening, because that's where it seems like people have better luck, both in this class and GEO555 my other class. For those going ahead in labs, I had almost forgot I do have some MXDs prepared with the data for labs 2, 3, and 4. It's most important for lab 3 and 4. So if you go to the MXD folder in GEO555, and habitat points might actually be lab 7. It's not labeled that way. So this, I think, is most important in lab 4, where it's looking for specific layers in a specific order. So that MXD should be all set up for that. Many of you are not there yet, and that's okay. I'm not suggesting we should be, but I know some people with prior experience have moved ahead, and that's okay too. I almost think, thanks for the reminder, I almost forgot about those. Oh no, is it okay? There's several cracks on this.
This is all the worst.
Oh, look at that. It's sad that that's now like an ancient piece of technology is just advancing. I think we've seen the technology curve. Feels like we're about at that part, which is exciting and scary simultaneously. So we ended the break, just before the break, we ended adding a brand new feature layer out of scratch, but we noted that there was no data. And this is a distinction that you've come across in GIS that we're touching upon here now. The difference between the feature layer in ArcMap and the actual data. The layer in ArcMap, as you know, is just a pointer to your data that is stored in a file, be it a geodatabase or a shapefile or some other form of GIS data. And the way in which we access actual GIS data is through workspaces and feature classes, like you see here in this title slide. So we're drilling down. We talked about the ArcMap application, then ArcMap MXD, the map document, data frames, even feature layers. Now we're going one step deeper into talking about workspaces and feature classes. And we'll end tonight on this topic, and we'll pick up this topic on the next lecture, March 30th as well. So the feature class represents the spatial data set behind a layer. So and I think everyone gets this, but just to review, you have a layer here, Canadian counties. The layer is named Canadian counties, the feature layer. But there's an actual feature data set. There's data behind it. In this case, it's a feature class in a geodatabase. The feature class in ArcObject is how you actually access the data directly. An I feature class is the most typical interface. So that's the kind of what we're gonna talk about now. Starting is actually referencing the GIS data directly. So that's the distinction between I feature class and I feature layer. So here, they start to come out. Here's this feature class and its default interface, I feature class. And some common properties and methods on it. This is also a screenshot from the general introduction from Esri showing that feature class is a subclass, co-class, that inherits from a more generic abstract called object class. feature class is specific to GIS data because a feature class has a shape field. Because obviously it's a GIS programming class, will almost, even though the object class abstract could let us edit all sorts of types of ODBC databases, Excel data, access, and so on. This is a GIS course, so we're going to focus on feature class specifically. Where is it here? So you see here we can get the name of the shape field from feature class, what shape type, and here's an enumeration. Is it point, line, polygon? And there's methods on feature class that we will use regularly going forward. Search is a select by attribute query, or it could be a select by location query. So a search on a feature class lets you build an attribute query. Create feature lets you create a brand new shape. You'll do that in Lab 7, and so on. So this is an important interface to be aware of in ArcObjects. So that's the feature class. But if you remember, the slide showed something called workspaces. The workspace and its associated classes that we'll talk about, some of these are kind of weird, are objects and classes that we use to find GIS data. The feature class is the GIS data, but the workspace represents a location where GIS data is. For example, ArcInfo coverage works. I'm going to go to that completely. Does anyone here know what an ArcInfo coverage is still? Yep, I need to take that out because I'm showing that's like a 1998 thing. That's coming out next year. So going directly to the number 2, shapefile workspace. Hopefully you know what a shapefile is. A shapefile workspace is a folder that this used to be Esri's preferred GIS format, ArcInfo coverage. A shapefile workspace, on the other hand, is a file folder with shapefiles in it. So for example, I'm borrowing some data from a course I did in the summer. There's some shapefiles in here. So that is a shapefile workspace, GEO555 data. So in the case of a shapefile workspace, it's a Windows, I'm assuming you're using Windows, which is probably a fairly good assumption. It's a Windows folder with shapefiles in it. There's a bunch of different types of workspaces, as you can see here. The class Access workspace is a personal geodatabase that has data in it. And a personal geodatabase uses Microsoft Access, so it'll be a file with a .mdb extension. It actually uses Access 2000, so it's MDB, not ACCDB, I think is their latest, Microsoft's latest version. File GDB workspace is a file geodatabase that contains feature classes. And then there's other types of workspaces like ArcSDE and raster, if it's a location that contains grids or other raster data sets. So again, these workspaces they represent locations where there's GIS data in a generic sense. Only data sets of that type can be accessed using that object. So if the folder has shapefiles in it and other things, when you create a shapefile workspace class on that folder, an object, it only sees the shapefiles. And we do that with, and this is what I think is kind of weird, a workspace factory. A workspace factory creates one of these workspace objects for us. So the workspace factory is the object we use to connect or create this location, where the workspace is simply the location. This might take a couple examples to sink in. So, maybe it'll be easier for you. I always found this a little confusing. So as I mentioned, from the last slide, the workspace factory is the object we use to connect to a specific workspace or data set. The workspace is actually the folder. So to get to a workspace, you can use open from file. on a workspace factory. But just like, remember iLayer, iFeature layer? Well, workspace factory is also a generic abstract. So there's specific types of workspace factories that we'll use as well. Here's a copy of the object model diagram from Workspace Factory with iWorkspace Factory. One method that you would use a lot is this open from file, as I handed on in the last slide. So if you already know a location where there's shapefiles, you get your Workspace Factory, open from file, give the Windows path to that location, and then you can get a workspace of shapefiles in that location. We could also create, say, in some cases maybe you're creating a new folder or a new location for GIS data, you could do that with the create method. I don't think we get into that, but I wanted to point that out. So the way to tell ARC objects which the way to tell ARC objects which type of data you're looking for is through the class that you create the object with. So we're still, in this case, we're declaring the variable with the iWorkspace Factory interface, but we're setting it to a specific class based on the desired data. So it's a little different. Or before break, we said iFeature layer variable equals feature layer, new feature layer class. Now we're taking the Workspace Factory abstract, finding a specific child that we're interested in, shapefile, using that class on the interface. And again, with the new, these are co-classes, so the new keyword applies. Does that make somewhat of sense? And it's a little bit weird. So here we're creating a brand new shapefile. This isn't necessarily creating new data or new location. This is creating a new Workspace Factory to look for data. This whole thing always seemed to be like a couple extra steps. And I would hope in future versions, I think that they could refine this a little. But to me, there's definitely a couple extra steps in here that shouldn't be necessary, but are. So we start with the Workspace Factory. You should be able to just find the data, in my opinion, but there's a couple things we need to go through first before we can do that. So now we have a new object of the class shapefile Workspace Factory with this interface. This slide shows the namespaces. Individual Workspace Factory classes are located in separate, another oddity, they're in different namespaces that you'll have to add depending on what type of data they represent. So if you want to work with shapefiles, like the example, you would need to add the reference to ESRI ArcGIS data sources file. If you want to work with geodatabases, you would add ESRI ArcGIS data sources GDB. Those two are probably the most common. If you're working with grids, which we don't in this class, I know that some may have interest, especially if you're doing environmental modeling. Like what Dr. Bian teaches you, you would use ESRI data sources raster. I'd love to get into all those things here. We just don't have enough time in one semester. So here are some names of classes depending on the types of workspace you're interested in. You know, shapefile is probably the most. Oh, these are ones specifically that are in that namespace. And on this list, we've already proven no one knows what that is anymore. Shapefiles will be relevant for sure. If you're using street map data, there's the class. You might end up working with AutoCAD data or TINs through data from other class, and that's where you would reference those. Here are some classes in the data sources GDB namespace. The first two and probably the second being of the most interest, I would think, for what you guys would work with. Obviously that depends widely on your specific area of study. And here are some sources of data, raster data sources in this namespace. Many of the classes are the same because geodatabases can still contain raster data. Raster data sets on the file system, like a grid, would be accessed with a raster workspace factory. Again, somewhat beyond what we're going to do here, but I think it's worth mentioning. I think I will pick up because we talk about this topic in the next lecture. We don't have too much left to go, but I think I will now hop a little bit into the March 30th lecture. Now we see if that seems way ahead, doesn't it? So we'll do some of the initial slides. How many are there? 47. We'll do some of the initial slides for March 30th. And as I mentioned at the onset, we'll have spring break next week, a working session on the 23rd, and then on the 30th, we'll pick up wherever we leave off. I'm going to have to remember that long or in the future, which is difficult. We'll pick up at that point on March 30th. So here's an example of using the workspace factory to access a specific object. In this case, a physical location that contains GIS data. So, in the first line we saw a couple slides ago, we're creating a new shapefile workspace factory. And I mentioned this earlier, we use the open from file method on the workspace factory. And with the open from file method, you can provide a string to the location. And on this screenshot, the string is simply the file path. We need to use double slashes in C# so it won't treat them as special escape characters. Remember /r/n for carriage return? Well, if the folder started with R, you don't want it to treat the /r as a carriage return. So we put double spaces or double slashes to indicate a file structure. And then the second option is just grabbing the ArcMap applications Windows handle, which is just arcmap.application.hwnv. The slide pictured here also shows the relationship between workspace and factory and workspace once again, and it ties this into last week's lecture. One of the relationships between classes we talked about was creation relationship. We showed the chicken and the egg, I think, for that example. And this shows that a workspace is created by a workspace factory. Workspace is not a co-class. You can't say, dim so-and-so variable equals new workspace. It's not a co-class. A workspace can only be created by workspace factory, just like the egg could just be created by the chicken. So one use of the workspace, obviously I'm sure you can think of many uses of this functionality, getting to a location of GIS data. And this gets a little weird. One use of the workspace factory workspace is to simply list all the data sets in a workspace. I need to look quick, see where I have some shapefiles. we go. We have, I'll keep that. So on the workspace, there's a property dataset names, which returns an dataset name. Well, excuse me, dataset get dataset names returns one of these enumerations we talked about earlier tonight. The enum dataset name interface lets us go through this workspace and list out all the different layers in it. So we'll do that example. Let me add another button. Call it March 9th workspaces. And notice these are all buttons, not tools. I'll copy the using statements. And now I'll add a new reference. Data sources file, which has some of these workspace factories in it. So I'm creating my workspace factory. I'll call it PWF. And notice, as I mentioned in the slides, I'm creating a new shapefile workspace factory class with that interface. I'm going to use this to look for a location with shapefiles. And then now the workspace factory is going to create a workspace. We saw that on a slide a moment ago. With that open from file. I don't remember that path. I'm going to have to go back and copy that. There we go. Put double slashes in. So now I've used the workspace factory to create a workspace at that file system location. Next, I'll prepare an enumeration. That's enum dataset name. And on the workspace, we can do the get dataset names property to populate that enumeration. So this is a list enumeration and another type of, and the argument type enumeration. It asks for the ESRI dataset type And if I click that dot, it will tell me what type of data set it's looking for. We can look for very specific types of data sets. The default is ESRI DT any, which is short for data type any. So this will return all data sets that are valid. Oh, and I forgot a variable name. So we had a slide on this earlier today. Now we'll practice it. We'll loop through an enumeration. And each individual data set is called an iDataset name. And as we saw, in the slide, about an hour ago, we can loop through each data set with the next method. And as long as there's another next, the dataset name will not be null. So we'll loop through this. Each time it'll return the next data set. When we get to the final data set, it will return null, and then the while loop will end. So to review what we talked about. Remember which library that's in. System.diagnostics. So for the debug class, we did something like this a month ago. Well, just to review, instead of doing a message box, I'm going to output the result to the debug window. But to do that, I need the, where is it? There we go. System.diagnostics.debug. Right line. That particular data set and its name. And as I always mention, make sure within the while loop to have a next statement so that you're able to go to the next thing. Build solution. It's going to take a minute to come up. don't see that. Oh, the category I had is March. Fix the category. Oops. So with the system diagnostic debug, instead of a message box, if you go back to Visual Studio, it writes the output in the output window, show off from debug. And that's going to look weird, but that's the name of the shape files in that folder. So that code has, notice I didn't have to add them to ArcMap or anything. I've used this. So that's the, makes sense to me in the project. It might look weird to you. Those are the names of the shape files that are in that folder. So without even adding them to ArcMap, I've written some code that analyzes data sets in a particular location. So I'm sure you could see where that might be useful. Oops, wrong class. So similar thing in the example in the slides. I mentioned this in passing, but the enumeration on get dataset names gives us the ability to look for specific types of datasets in the location. I chose ESRI BT any, or dataset type any. And so now that would be used if, say, you didn't know, we don't know the layers, and we're using this to get a list of layers in the folder. Sometimes you do know. In this screenshot, I know that in this folder I have a shapefile called states details. I can get to the feature class, remember feature class is the GIS data, with an open feature class method right on the workspace. So here we've gone workspace factory to workspace. In this particular instance, I know the name of the shapefile I want. I can get a feature class with that open feature class method with the name of the shapefile, and that gives us an I feature class. And just this, in this particular example, we then do a feature count to show how many features are in it. So I could go back to, we'll do this and then we'll end. I'll show you some of the new, what some of the slides show. So here I'm opening, like we just looked at, we're going from workspace factory to workspace, and we're opening a specific shapefile within a workspace, within a folder. So I said it's this method, open feature class, is handy if we know the data set's there. Use a try block because you think you know it's there, but you might not know it's there. That gives us the feature class we need. Where I'm tying this together, remember just before break we added a layer and there was no data? Well, now we know how to grab a GIS feature class. So let's go back and edit that button I wrote before break and actually add a shapefile to it. So that will involve just, once we use the example on the previous slide, would add one more line, our new feature layer assigning its feature class. So this line here assigns GIS data to our new layer. And this is what the example would look like. Now it does have GIS data on it. And this will be a good stopping point when we're done with this shortly. So like I said, a try catch block is a good thing to put in here. If say your feature class isn't there, warn the user and bail out. You're expecting a feature class in the folder, but it's not there. Someone deleted it. Your code won't work, so bail out gracefully. So I'm going to, well, first I'm going to change the folder location. Well, even before that, I'm going to make them shapefiles. They're actually street map data sets. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to my layers example. Where did I do that? Adding layer example. So here's where we created that new layer, Greg's layer, right before break. Oh. I have them right here. I'm already as shapefiles in that folder. Oh, I see, feature workspace. So the other change I have to make to the previous example is we use a specific workspace interface iFeature workspace that specifically helps us find workspaces with GIS data. So it's strange. Now I can do iFeature class, and I'll call it PFC equals pwork. And now I see my open feature class. I think it was called US counties. So this is all new. You see what I'm doing here? I'm creating a shapefile workspace factory. I'm opening the Windows location of that folder into iFeature workspace, not iWorkspace. And then I can take iFeature class and open it there. Now, down here when I created my new layer, I just assign that feature class. So now when I create my new layer, I'm actually going to grab that shapefile and adding it. And this, as soon as this works, I'm optimistic, we'll stop, because then the next section is starting to talk about symbology. So this is a great breaking point. assuming it works. It's still a great breaking point. So, when I do adding layer this time, notice what it did new. It added a Greg's data layer, just like we did before, but now there's data associated with it. Because we used the workspace to go grab that shapefile that I used last summer of counties and attach that shapefile to my feature layer. So, to reiterate, we've gone, found data, assigned it to a feature layer, and added it to a map. Are there any questions? So we made part way through March 30th. So then we'll end for tonight. We'll pick up with slide 12 on March 30th. But beforehand, next week is spring break, and then on March 23rd we'll have a class session where we can show up and can help you work through any questions you have on the labs. And if there's no other questions, we're done for tonight. And have a great spring break. Let's hope the weather stays a little bit nicer.